Appalachia, the word that evokes a whole passel of reactions. Everything from the beauty of a mountaintop to trailer parks, drugs, and about everything in between. The Appalachian Mountains are indeed the oldest mountains in the world, and they once towered 30,000 feet into the air. They stretch from eastern Canada through 14 states all the way to Louisiana. The folks who live in these mountains have faced an unending number of tragic and just plain odd happenings that cry out for the telling. Hello, I'm Larry Bentley, and I was born and raised in these very mountains by family who themselves were born, raised, and lived for generations in the Appalachian Mountains. Come with me, and we'll take a look at some of the unending stories that came from within my beloved mountains, and we'll look through the eyes of an Appalachian at some outside the area as well. Welcome to Season 5 of Appalachian Murder, Mystery, and Legend. Howdy, my good friends. I hope you're doing well today. Thank you so much for stopping by. Now, we've talked about some pretty wild wackadoodles in previous episodes, but today's is going to be one that gives a unique look at one of the most self-destructive one of them that ever graced the mountains of Kentucky. I got to tell you up front that this one was just a pain in the backside to research. To be the tragedy that it was, there wasn't a whole lot of background on the character of the victims or the character himself or the victims involved other than the straight up carrying out of the crime itself by the wackadoodle in question. So have a seat, buckle up, and grab you a cold drink, and let me tell you about the Blue Heaven. Now, the picture you see there is a man named George Collett, and George was born to Horace Greeley Napier and his wife Mary Rebecca on April 12, 1895 in Garrard County, Kentucky. And for some reason or another, and it was very rare to happen then, the two lovebirds turned into hateful old buzzards toward each other and divorced. After the divorce, apparently George's mother had a man waiting on deck named William Bill Collett, who she married and who adopted George and raised him as his own. That would indicate to me that his biological father must have been some kind of a piece of work, and it's likely was what caused the divorce in the first place. Most of the time back in the day, it was probably to the overconsumption of the old homemade firewater that we hear so much about. But that would be how George Collett wound up with the Collett name. Now, there ain't a whole lot that I could find about George's upbringing. I would venture to guess that would be because that he was raised right out there in the Cumberland Plateau, just north of Clinch Mountain, which during the turn of the century into the 1900s, that was what we might call out in the boonies. Now, and living out in the boonies, now that would be a challenge enough to where the last thing in the world you worry about is documenting the raising of a child. Now, that being because they were too busy making sure that they had enough to eat and enough put away for the winter time. You've all probably seen them old pictures of dead folks that were taken of them standing, sitting, or maybe laying down and made them look like they were still alive. That Victorian death photography is what it was known as today. Now, you probably also wondered what kind of weirdo would do that, much less actually want it done bad enough to pay for it. But most of the time, that would be the only picture that the family would have of their loved one because they just hadn't had the opportunity, time, money, or even on a camera until after something bad happened and they actually wanted a picture to remember them by. And that was pretty much the popular thing to do or have done back in those days. Now, I pointed that out just to let you know how rare a picture was in the lives of hillbillies back in the day. Most of the records of a child's upbringing was told by the upbringers by word of mouth. All that would be the reason that there's pretty much nothing about George's life in any official records until he got a little older. Now, George lived his young life pretty much in obscurity until 1916, when the United States started having its merchant ships sunk on the way to deliver goods to the Allies. Now, by 1917, that had progressed into a passenger ship being sunk, which really ticked off President Wilson, who you see there holding a piece of paper that probably made him a little bit mad, especially since the ones doing all the sinking was Germany, and the Kaiser hadn't any plans at all of slowing down or stopping anything. In fact, he'd wrote a letter to Mexico trying to get them to attack the U.S. too, and that's probably the piece of paper you see there in Wilson's hand, because the letter was intercepted on its way to Mexico, and that was the final straw. President Wilson asked for and received a declaration of war from Congress on April 6, 1917, and that led to the military draft being fired back up, and George was either drafted or elected to serve. And it's not clear which one happened, but the whole country, including George, were dragged into World War I. George served in the Army. Oh, we got to remember at this time, it, it was during the time when anything goes on the battlefield. Weren't no Geneva Convention rules of engagement or any Marquis of Queensberry rules on the hand-to-hand combat. Now, all the countries involved just threw anything they could pull out of the rear ends at their enemy, up to and including biological and chemical weapons, which left soldiers laying on the battlefield twitching for hours before they finally died. If they happened to survive, they were never the same. But about the only thing that was effective in battle was digging a trench up to your shoulders, where you could use your M1917 rifle to pick off the enemy, if you got a good shot, that was. Of course, the enemy, they did the same thing, which meant that you spent a long time in the trench trying to get a shot, only to be bombarded with artillery, or watch as your enemy was blown to bits by the artillery once the higher-ups got tired of the stalemate you was all stuck in. And once the war ended and George got out, it was said that he was outright mentally ill, and most said that it was from what had happened during the war. He claimed that he had been gassed with mustard gas, which was pretty much like being sprayed with pure hot boiling liquid plumber. Now, he was collecting a pension, which does indicate that he was probably injured in some way during the war, but who knows how true his story was. Now, it was also said that by folks who had known him before he served that he was just plain meaner than a rattlesnake and had always been a holy terror, and he wasn't no different than he always been. Now, he was married 3 times and was never together long enough to have any children of his own, and his temper was a legend in his own time. It was either his way or the highway, and looks to me like the highway was starting to rut out from overuse. Now, by 1935, George was nearing the end of his 3rd marriage and was the owner and operator of the Blue Heaven Night Spot just off the highway a bit north of Broadhead, Kentucky. Now, I think that's off of Highway 150 there in Broadhead, if I remember. But by then, running a dewdrop in like that wasn't the only thing he was up to. From what I read, if you can name the illegal activity, there's a real good chance that George was as deep in the middle of that as he ever was a foxhole in the war. Now, on January 8th, 1935, which just happens to be the very day that the biggest star of Melungeon heritage, Elvis Presley, was born. But I suppose George hadn't heard the news because he did his normal getting all red-assed up over whatever struck him the wrong that day. Now, he was sizzling like a hot pork chop on a grill at his wife over her and her entire family. Apparently, somebody dropped a dime on him for a robbery that he was supposedly part of. Upon receipt of the said information, the anonymous person or persons, police officers, went before a judge carrying their probable cause affidavit for a search warrant, where the judge scratched out his John Henry right on the front page of it, giving them all the permission they needed to go take a look at George's property. So they raided the Blue Heaven, which was also George's home. He lived upstairs, and they found exactly the stolen goods they were looking for. That was enough to charge George all up with a good case of robbery. Now, he was in a heap of trouble, and he needed to sell the Blue Heaven to have a little cash to pay for his defense. At least that was the way he was telling it. In reality, it was said that he wanted money to finance a run for the border, being that the U.S. dollar at the time was worth about 14 times more in Mexico than it was here. So he could go from rags to riches just by simply crossing a line in the sand there. There was only one problem the police had, and as far as that goes, George wasn't home when they came knocking. He went on the down low and wasn't sticking his head out of any hidey hole that they could find or that they knew about. Now, I guess he aimed to sell the Blue Heaven from parts unknown. Who knows what goes through the minds of these nutballs? But there was one small hitch in the get along in that plan, and that was George's divorce wasn't final yet, which meant his wife Stella was still part owner, and he needed to get her to sign the paperwork before the sale would go through. I don't know why he was worried about being all legal up on that point, but he sure enough was. Now, Bill Helton, now he was George's father-in-law, told his daughter Stella not to sign a dadgum thing until her lawyer perused it first. Now, that would be the reason for the chapping to George's rear end, and what led him to think that his soon-to-be ex-wife was the one that called the law on him to start with. Well, I can tell you that it wasn't her, but it really didn't matter. George was already mad at the entire Hilton family before he reasoned out, in his mind at least, that his wife turned on him for the robbery, turned him in for the robbery. Now, there's no evidence that I could find that she turned him in at all, like I said. And in fact, all I read says that her father Bill was the one that sung to the police like Bill Monroe on Saturday night at the Rosine Barn. Now, folks, the wackadoodle mind works wonders sometimes. It don't matter if said individual actually does anything to the wackadoodle in question. All the wackadoodle needs to do is think they did something, and they're going to pay the price as if they did. And I reckon that makes everything all right in their mind. Folks, try as I might, there ain't a whole lot to find out about the Hilton family either. Maybe for the same reason that there wasn't a whole lot to find out about George's upbringing. As is the norm for reporting things like this, reporters tend to focus on the perpetrator of the crime and leave the poor victims twisting in the wind of obscurity, especially back in the heyday of newspapers back then. Even today, in my humble opinion, to the media, there's names on a tombstone sometimes. And I will say this, since we now have the alternative podcasts, folks I've listened to do a whole lot better with letting folks know who the victims of these crimes are. They had lives, kinfolks, and dreams, all of which was taken from them by some nut job for pretty much no reason at all in most cases. Now, from everything that I read, the Hilton family were fine, upstanding, hardworking, and humble people who were well thought of by the whole community. And the Board's family, they were the same. Seems like these are the type folks that the wackadoodle seeks out for destruction way too many times. Now, back on January 8th, 1935, when Carlos and Howard Hilton, who were George's brother-in-laws, got a note from George to meet him at the Blue Heaven. And I reckon George was playing his version of the fugitive when he slinked up and slipped a note under the front door or something shady like that. Anyway, the two brothers decided to mosey on down to the Blue Heaven nightclub and see what George wanted. Now, I imagine they thought that it wouldn't hurt to hear what he had to say, and heck, it just might involve a drink or two, which wouldn't hurt anything either. Now, for all they knew, he could be wanting to smooth things over with their sister, and working things out was a good bit better than going through a divorce, because back then, people who've been through a divorce were looked at as damaged goods. Now, once the men got there, they waited a spell. When George didn't show up, they headed back toward Copper Creek. Now, a little ways up the road, they came across George, hoofing it toward the Blue Heaven on foot. He told them that he needed to meet with them because he had something for him. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that statement would make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. George led him over to the woods near where he was walking, handed him a couple of lit cigarettes that he'd fired up for him in his own yap, and right when they were in the middle of their first drags, he whipped out a gun and started blasting. Both Carlos and Howard were shot right there. Now, from there, because he still hadn't done near enough, he walked to the Hilton home in the Copper Creek settlement near Crab Orchard. Now, being that the Blue Heaven was a couple of miles north of Broadhead, that means that he walked about 5 miles. Now, for any normal individual, that what ain't caught all up in the main problem that exists with all good wackadoodles, and that would be it's always about me. That would be plenty of time to cool off. It would take an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours to walk for that far for a normal human being. But instead of cooling off, the wackadoodle tends to stew like a slow cooker and get even worse as time goes on. Now, once he arrived at the Hilton home where his wife was staying, now he must have had steam blowing out both ears because he hit the front door blasting. Yes, folks, in that day and location, you likely didn't even have locks on the doors, let alone be able to lock them. In the event they did have locks on the doors, it's hard to believe today, I know, but Most of the time they weren't used. That was true even when I was a little feller. It was a whole other world we lived in back then, folks. Now, living in the Appalachian Mountains, you hardly ever saw anybody else outside the family anyway, so you didn't think about a moonbat come around to cause a bunch of mayhem. Besides, they'd have probably let him in anyway, for the same reason that Carlos and Howard went to meet with the idiot. But he wound up shooting his father-in-law in the kitchen, and the three women were all sleeping in the bed, and he shot them. They were Stella, his wife, and her mother, Lucy Helton, and he even popped his head inside the third bedroom where he shot Stella's sister, Lona Helton Jackson. Now, Lona was critically injured and was laying next to her daughter, who the nutball missed. So she wasn't injured. Violet Jackson was Lona's 5-year-old daughter and was the only person not wounded in the whole fiasco. Now, apparently, he still hadn't done enough and hadn't been enough death, destruction, and mayhem to suit him because he headed next door to the Board's house, which, from what I read, actually was a pretty fair paced walk for being next door. Properties back out in the rural areas like that were kind of spread out, big farmhouses that were on big farms. Now, the Board's son, State Trooper John Boards, was likely or lucky enough to be one of the lawmen who raided the Blue Heaven and was in on the hunt for George while he was on the low from the jail. Now, he just walked in and started blasting there too. Apparently, he either just wounded them, missed them entirely, or maybe they heard the war zone next door and were awake because they were able to make a break for it. But nobody I know have ever and could ever outrun a bullet. And of course, it goes without me having to say it. But the time he left the Board's house, they were no longer with us and were left laying in the front yard. Yes, there's reports stating that he shot them while they were sleeping, but from what I know about the case, I believe they were found in the yard. I reckon that must have made him feel a little bit better, a little bit more like he pretty much set things straight, in his mind at least, I guess. But because after that, he went over to the nearest diner and had a nice breakfast. Back in, it was probably a big slice of country cured ham and red-eye gravy with 3 or 4 eggs and a couple of them big cat head biscuits. He didn't have a worry in the world, folks. Then he ended up going to a campground in Broadhead, managed by one Herbert Mobley, where he rented a cabin. He got undressed, laid down in bed like nothing ever happened. There's one thing the moron didn't do, and that was actually kill everybody he shot. After Carlos was shot, he was hit in the shoulder and managed to run to the nearby home of Pat Head, who was a neighbor. Now, she helped him out and called the law. And after the shooting at the Helton house, Miss Jackson was seriously wounded, but she managed to get little Violet, and she ran barefooted in her night clothes to get help. Miss Howard Helton, not even knowing her husband was dead, and another neighbor were the first to arrive on the scene. After showing up at the scene and seeing all the carnage, Rock Kessel County Sheriff D.C. Clark went back to the station, swore in special deputies, and sent the posse out to bring the mangy dog in, setting up or draped across a horse in a bag. And I'm sure he probably mentioned a couple of times before sending them out that there was a whole lot less paperwork involved in draped across a horse method. Now, Sheriff Clark contacted Kentucky Adjutant General Henry H. Stanhart, who sent state troopers from Frankfort and Harrodsburg to help. Now, once they found the idiot, because somebody knew where he was and called it in, they found him holed up in his cabin. Now, they surrounded the place and ordered him out. Now, we got to remember here that the wackadoodle mind operates at well over 100 miles an hour, as well as from the standpoint of pure spite and vengeful malice. Now, he apparently thought that his best option was to take himself hostage, and while his big 44 hog-leg special was held against his own temple, he dropped the hammer on himself, and just to show them all how serious he was, and probably because everybody was laughing at him. Well, it might not have happened exactly like that, but he did end himself after he was surrounded, and did it with the same weapon that he'd used to wipe everybody else out. Now, mind you, the 44 hog-leg special wasn't a Magnum like you see in the Dirty Harry movies. It was a 44 caliber Peacemaker style revolver, but the bullet had a lower muzzle velocity, so less power, in other words. So what I'm saying is that instead of removing everything from his neck up, it probably just left a hole slightly big enough to drive a small truck through. But short of a shotgun, it probably had the shock value that he's looking for on the folks that had to go in and mop him up off the floor. Yes, folks, the wackadoodle was going to show them all because it's all about him. And I reckon they were supposed to be sorry they made him do all of this because you know that he didn't have a choice. But following his death, officers found $104 in cash. I guess he would have had 105 if he hadn't eaten breakfast, and two revolvers on his body, the Smith and Wesson hog leg and a German Luger. They also found a will/manifesto where he explained to everybody how he didn't do nothing, and they'd charged him with, and the police hounded him for nothing until they drove his wife nuts and she left him. And of course, he didn't have anything to do with that either, I imagine. Now, he wanted them to give his guns to George Payne, along with some instructions to use the money that he had previously gave Mr. Payne earlier, to have a story written about his pitiful, tragic, piss-poor existence, and to be sure to put some flowers on his grave once they chunked him into clay. Now, maybe somebody ought to have planted some poison ivy or maybe some poison oak all over it. That would probably be the right thing to do. Now, he asked Circuit Judge J.S. Sandusky to investigate the way he was treated by police. Now, he said that the only reason that he killed his wife was to protect her from all the abuse by the police and so that he could be with her on the other side, too. I reckon all the other people he killed just didn't count in his mind. Now, I hope they're all waiting on the other side to kick his ass until they're tired of kicking, to be honest with you. Julian and Helen Boards were laid to rest with a state police escort. There was a whole throng of people that visited the funeral home to see George's body. It wasn't often folks got a close look at a pure certified dyed-in-the-wool nut job wackadoodle, so there were large crowds at all the funerals too.